Welcome to the Embracing Brokenness podcast, where our goal is to engage with all of those willing to venture deeper into their transformational journey with Christ. Here's your host and co-founder of Embracing Brokenness Ministries, Steve Adams.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Embracing Brokenness podcast. You're in for a special treat today because we have a special guest, Professor Nancy Pearcey, and we will be talking about her latest book called The Toxic War on Masculinity. Very relevant in today's world that we are living in. And so just to give you a little bit of a background on Professor Pearcey, she co-authored a column in Christianity Today for 7 years and also was a columnist for Human Events. She has authored hundreds of articles appearing in outlets such as Fox News, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, The Daily Caller, The American Enterprise, American Thinker. The list is endless. Focus on the Family's Thriving Family, CNS, Law Review. Pearcey studied under Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri in the early 70s, and after earning an MA, did additional graduate work at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. Now, she has taught at Biola, visiting scholar, Torrey Auner's Institute, World Journalism Institute, Francis Schaeffer Scholar, Cairn University, which is not far actually from here. She was a professor and scholar of worldview studies. She's been invited to speak at dozens of Christian seminaries and on campuses such as USC, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, the University of Georgia, Dartmouth, Stanford, and Princeton. Hailed in The Economist as America's pre-eminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. That's a mouthful, but it's true. I talked to her, trust me. Pearcey has spoken to actors and screenwriters in Hollywood, to scientists at Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories, to staffers on Capitol Hill and the White House, and to think tank and public policy groups such as Family Research Council, Faith and Law, Concerned Women for America, Eagle Forum, Council for National Policy, Constitutional Coalition, and Heritage Foundation. She's currently a fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Now, as the founding and executive editor of Breakpoint Radio, Pearcey wrote 1,000+ radio commentaries and edited thousands more for broadcast. A former commentator on Public Square Radio, Pearcey has made more than 300 media appearances, that's 300, including Hot Air TV, Bill Bennett Show, Dennis Miller Show, Dennis Prager Show, NPR, Fox and Friends, Focus on the Family, Breitbart, and C-SPAN's Book TV, and The Mike Huckabee Show. Best-selling author Nancy Pearcey gives a strategic guide to the war on masculinity and how to win it. That's what we're going to talk about in this podcast and likely the next. So it's become, unfortunately, socially acceptable to express open hostility against men. So almost half of American men agree with the statement, quote, "These days society seems to punish men just for acting like men." All right, so this book is going to open up your eyes to a lot of topics within the research that Nancy did. It was intensive, extensive. But she's also an author of many other books. Her earlier books include, and this is one of them, Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and 2 ECPA Gold Medallion Award winners. How Now Shall We Live? That's co-authored with Harold Fickett and also Chuck Colson, and Total Truth. Her books have been translated into 19 languages. Okay, so I could go on and on and on. She was a former agnostic, and that's why one of the reasons she spoke at universities such as Princeton, Stanford, USC, and Dartmouth. She's been quoted in the Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one, as we said earlier, one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today. That's amazing. So, all that being said, without further ado, Professor Nancy Pearcey. Well, folks, be prepared to be educated. At least that's my word for it. We have with us on the podcast today, Professor Nancy Pearcey. She's a professor of apologetics and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University and an author of at least 7 books that I'm aware of. She may be able to tell us if there's more than that.
I can't keep track. I'll go with your number.
All right, sounds good. Well, along those lines, I am sure that there is a lot happening right now at the school. So I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me. I appreciate that as well.
Well, I had the opportunity, as I think we spoke about earlier, to interview Elisa Childers on the podcast. It was in a couple months ago. And subsequently, I heard an interview that you did with her around your latest book. I'm going to hold it up right here so everybody can see, because we're doing this on video and on audio. But for those of you who can't see it, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Okay, so Amazon, get it. Look at what I did. Look at all that marked up, flags, all that. And I know that our audience will benefit from hearing your heart on this issue. It's a huge topic today, and you timed it perfectly. So you may know this, but in our ministry, we speak a lot about personal brokenness, and hence the name of the ministry, and the effects of original sin in each of our lives. As we're fallen human beings, and how significant people that we grow up around impact our ability to properly interpret the world around us, how we see God, how we see ourselves and others. And you have a story of your own that would back that up. It also gave you at least part of the motivation to write this book. And in the very beginning, if not mistaken, you provide us with some context from your own journey as a youngster in a household where, you and your siblings were consistently uncertain as to who was coming home each night, right? Your public father or your private one, I think is what you call it. Could you tell our audience a little bit about that experience and how that impacted you growing up?
Yes, I did put this story right at the front of the book because it's a major reason I decided to write the book. I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist?
Oh, gosh.
And it was closed fist. It was a knuckle fist, in fact. That was his favorite.
Oh, wow.
I had a little sharper stab of pain there. So not surprisingly, and by the way, he was very open about it. He would say, do this, I'll beat you. He wasn't hiding anything. And so it was a big part, I think, of why I eventually did walk away from my Christian upbringing in high school, about midway through high school. I walked away from my faith. And I'll have to tell you, one of the reasons is that I asked my father point blank one day, why are you a Christian? And he said, works for me. Wow. And I said, that's it? He's a university professor. And I really thought he would have something more to say. And I also had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, who, by the way, was also my uncle. And I thought I'd get something more substantial from him. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as though it were a psychological phase that I would outgrow. And so eventually I decided that maybe Christianity just didn't have any answers. And I walked away from my faith, my Christian upbringing at that point, and dove head first into secular isms, secular philosophies. I decided if the adults in my life can't help me, maybe it's up to me to just read all the religions and philosophies of the world. That's how I thought of it, and figure out which one was really true, which was rather ambitious for a 16-year-old.
Well, yeah, then it's not uncommon today. You would see that even more so, right?
I think so. Yes. In fact, the Institute for Family Studies just put out days ago a new study finding that in my day, kids were losing their faith in high school, or certainly by college. That was actually the more common. Now they say it's 13. Oh, now wow. The studies are showing that kids are losing their faith by 12 and 13. And it was interesting because they did a graph, and they showed the results of talking to kids, right? So the kids were saying, they were asking them questions like, how important is your religion to you, and so on. And the kids were way up here saying, nope, nope, nope. And then they asked the parents, and the parents were, oh yeah, my kid's really into it. Oh yeah, my kid's still really committed. The parents were clueless.
Wow.
So I thought, well, that was my family for sure.
Well, I wouldn't want to be raising them today under those circumstances. It's tough. It's very hard.
It's very hard. We've got to get apologetics down to the 12 and 13-year-old level now, because when my parents, you can understand why I was afraid of my father. I was afraid to tell him what, that I was walking away from the Christian upbringing that he'd given me. So I didn't tell my parents. They never knew until much later. And so it's a wake-up call that parents really need to be talking more deeply with their children and finding out what they're really thinking, and making sure that they're addressing their children's questions.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, you did a marvelous job here writing, exposing one of the hottest topics in society today. I mean, it is just even starting with the title of the book. It's not the war on toxic masculinity. It's the toxic war on masculinity. Well said. Distinction with a difference, I think. I'll let people think about that a little bit. People often accuse evangelical Christian men, I guess I'd be one of them, of being oppressed patriarchs. I never thought of myself that way, prone to abuse. But you make the surprising claim that they test out as having the lowest levels of abuse and divorce. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was a big surprise for me too. So this came out of the research I did. I would not have expected this, because the media narrative, of course, is that if you hold to any notion of male headship in the home, that will turn you into an overbearing, oppressive, domineering, tyrannical patriarch.
Yeah.
And I'll give you, it was easy to find examples. So I give several examples in the book, but I'll give you just one. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which came after the Me Too movement.
Right.
And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is the social scientists, psychologists, and sociologists were looking at these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? So they went and did the studies. And in my book, I cite some dozen or more studies done where they, in fact, found out that the media narrative has it completely backward, that, in fact, evangelical Christian men are the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And by the way, the first pushback I get is, oh, sure, the wives said they were happy. The husband's sitting right there.
Oh my gosh.
But in fact, that's not true. Most of these studies were drawn from large public secular studies, like the General Social Survey, which is done by the University of Chicago, and which is, the data from that is mined by journalists and policymakers and so on. So they're taking from these large databases, and the women are interviewed separately. And so the wives of evangelical men test out as saying they're the happiest with their husbands' expressions of love and affection. Evangelical men are the most engaged fathers in terms of the time they spend with their children, both in shared activities like sports or church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, lower than any other group in America. And then the real surprise is they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence, lower than any major group in America.
Wow.
So this was a complete surprise to me as well, because I had to go digging into the academic literature to find this. It's not out in the public yet. And really, it was my final reason for writing the book. I said, we've got to get this information out. And sometimes a single quote can crystallize it. So let me give you one quote on it.
Please do. Yes, wonderful.
So this is my I call him my go-to sociologist.
Okay.
In the sense he did the largest study, and he's also considered by many people to be sort of the top marriage researcher in America. And to give you a sense of his status, he writes in places like the New York Times. So this is an article from the New York Times.
Okay.
And he says, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. And of course, they're asking about the wives again, because the assumption is that evangelical men are these oppressive patriarchs who silence their wives. The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his fellow academics, and this is actually my favorite part. Most sociologists, it's a very secularized field.
Sure.
So many of them are secular. And he says to them, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So this is great because what it means is, this is not a pep talk from a religious leader.
Right.
This is solid empirical research.
Don't you love it when secular researchers show us the things that we would like to see to be true, even in this sense? Like, it's great. It's good stuff.
It's evidence-based findings. So we need to be bringing it into the churches, but we can also be bringing it into the public square and helping people to see that the media narratives are just wrong, that the data has totally debunked the media narratives.
Well, tell us a little bit. Again, we're talking about divorce rates, and you refer to this study in particular that likely would be parallel to the reality that divorce rates then in Christian homes, those that would have, I would call it maybe a biblical worldview of life and their commitment to Christ in that way. Tell us more about that distinction, if you will.
Yeah. So again, one of the major objections I always get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as everyone else? And so the researchers went back to the data and they separated out men who are truly committed, who are living out their faith authentically, who attend church regularly, from people who claim to be evangelical but don't actually attend church, or rarely, if at all. So nominal Christians. By the way, my students don't know what nominal means, so I have to tell them NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only.
There might be a few of us that didn't know that too. So thank you.
We're not going to admit it.
No.
But so these might be men who, in a survey like this, might check, say, the Baptist box, for example. But it's mostly cultural and family heritage. It's not a really personal commitment. And these men test out shockingly different. They test out, first of all, their wives test out as the least happy with their husband's treatment of them. They spend less time with their children than any other group. They have the highest rate of divorce, even higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America, even higher than secular men. So this is why the numbers get so skewed. If you just do a study on evangelicals, umbrella, you will get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so the numbers are always going to be misleading. So this was fascinating. It turns out you have to make this really crucial distinction, because here's what the church is up against. For example, how do we encourage the men who are doing a good job, who feel demeaned and demoralized by our culture's hostility to masculinity? And they do. I teach at Houston Christian University. And when I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of the male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Oh.
So even in Christian circles, young men do feel demeaned. I quoted in my book, I quoted a psychotherapist who writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, the young men coming into my practice today are increasingly demoralized and feeling defeated because they feel as if they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. A survey a couple of years ago found that almost half of American men said, these days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men.
Wow.
So, and one more anecdote from the church. One of my graduate students was the head of a women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, we need to stop scolding. I really avoided this scolding tone in my book. I wanted to say, look, Christian men really need to be encouraged and affirmed and supported for what they are doing well, that they are testing out better than any other group in America. But then we also have this challenge of these nominal Christians who are skewing our results, right? Who are in some ways ruining the reputation of evangelicals. And what they're doing is they're hanging around the fringes of the Christian world just enough to take the language of headship and submission, but they're infusing those words with meaning from the secular script for masculinity, entitlement, dominance, control, and so on. And people sometimes ask me, but why would they be even worse than secular men? Well, because they feel religious justification for what they're doing if they're mistreating their wife and children the secular guy might be mistreating his wife and children, but, he doesn't feel any religious justification for it. But the nominal Christian does. And so he ends up having the worst of both worlds. He ends up actually being on the worst group in America in terms of abuse and violence.
That is such a disturbing fact in my own mind, because, and it's not like, first of all, it's not my reputation to protect. God does a fine job of protecting his own reputation, but truth, right? We talk a lot about truth, biblical truth, and even truth in society today. It is so far out of line. It's why you wrote, partly to bring this to light. Like, this is a reality of the world we live in. We have to know how to train our children up to live in a different type of society. And so thankful that you pointed that out, because many of us were discouraged to think, wow, man, like half of the church is divorcing. That's no different than the rest of the world. Like, what really is the distinction here? And you get discouraged when you start understanding. But when truth comes into the picture, everything changes. So I'm going to take you back to the book for a second. On page 19, to be specific, you cited an experiment that sociologist Michael Kimmel started by asking cadets at West Point a couple of questions, exposing the fact that men are being torn between two competing scripts for masculinity. What are they?
Yeah, I love this. And by the way, it started at West Point, but then because Michael Kimmel is well known in his field, he gets invited to speak all around the world.
Right.
And so he turned it into an experiment that he did in countries from Brazil to Sweden to Australia.
Yeah.
And he asks young men two questions. The first question is, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? All around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They said things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologist Michael Kimmel would say, where'd you learn that? And the young men would say, oh, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. Wow. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid.
Oh, my gosh.
Using their language.
Yes, of course.
And so really, Michael Kimmel, the sociologist, concludes that men are really being torn between these two scripts, that they do innately know what it means to be a good man.
Yeah.
And a lot of these were not Christian cultures. So I would say, as a Christian, our explanation is they are made in God's image, right?
Yes.
And they do inherently know what it means to be a good man. Yeah. Romans 2, we all have a conscience. And so, but on the other hand, they do sense cultural pressure to be the real man. And so it gives us a new way to approach these issues. On the one hand, most men don't respond well to being called toxic.
Yeah, that's right.
And so a much better approach is, can we tap into their innate sense of what it means to be a good man? Can we affirm and support them in that innate, inherent knowledge that they already hold?
Right.
And secondly, it means that when we communicate a Christian ethic for manhood, it's not contrary to their intrinsic nature. If you were to read some of the secular people writing today, who say, well, men are just naturally uncivilized and promiscuous and wild, and they would say, oh, the Christian ethic does not match the masculine nature. Yes, it does. It matches what they inherently know is the good man. I'll follow up with just a shorter study. This was by an anthropologist, and it was the first cross-cultural study ever done of concepts of masculinity. And he found something very similar. He said no matter what their definition of masculinity was, so a culture might be more warlike, another might be more peaceful, but he said they all shared the expectation that a man performs what he called the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. or
wow.
become a father, build
Yes.
into the next generation.
Yes.
And I thought, there it is again.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, to give it a theological term, this is general revelation, right? This is what general revelation is, the truth that people can know just because they're made in God's image and live in God's world, apart from the Bible. General revelation has shown men that in all cultures, that their unique masculine strengths, right? Because they are bigger, stronger, faster than women, but that those unique strengths are not given them just to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, to care for the people that they love.
I think those are great points. And men, if you're listening out there, take heart. What Nancy's sharing is truth about how we, maybe sometimes how the world perceives us, but we have opportunity here to make a difference in the lives of people around us by beginning to go deeper into these questions and not just accept this and go find ourselves a hole somewhere and bury ourselves in it. Because Nancy, men they're falling behind, right? In education, employment, health, even life expectancy. I was a little bit surprised to hear that. I just watched something recently on Netflix where someone did a little bit of a study around the world and found that there are pockets, they call them blue zones, where people are living longer. You might have seen that. I don't know how scientific that was, but there was a lot that went into the study that he did. And so there might be pockets of where men are living longer, but the reality is here in the United States and the West, that's not true, right? Why are people ignoring, I guess, the real problems men face today is the question, I guess.
Yes, I appreciate you asking that, because that is one of the questions I raise in the book, which is, I ran into this even at a Christian college. I would say I'm writing a book of masculinity, and my female students would say, why should we care?
Oh my gosh.
Well, the point is, most CEOs and presidents and Hollywood film directors are still male. And that's true. The top 5 to 10% of men. But on average, this is the important point. On average, men are actually falling behind. They're doing worse. They're doing worse compared to where they were, and they're doing worse in relation to women. So starting with education, boys are falling behind at all levels of education, starting in kindergarten. That's so tragic. Even in kindergarten, boys are getting the message that they're not as smart as girls. They don't have the fine motor control, for example, to handle scissors and coloring. All the way up to college. In college, the average college in the U.S. now is 60% female and 40% male. Some colleges are quietly starting affirmative action to get more male students.
Oh, boy. Reverse the trend. Okay.
More women than men go to graduate school. More women than men are getting professional degrees like law and medicine. So women are, and it's even worse with minorities. Minority women are doing far better than minority men in terms of education. And then when they are adults, like you were mentioning, men are more likely to be homeless, to have mental illness, to commit crime, to be, 90% of the prison population is male, to be a victim of crime, to be drug and alcohol addicted, and so on. So, and then what you mentioned, life expectancy. Men's life expectancy has gone down in recent years. Women's has stayed the same. So it's not a general trend. There's a magazine called The New Scientist, and it said, the major demographic now for early death is being male.
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh.
So that's really something. And this was another shocker for me. Did you notice this one? Unemployment levels are at Depression era levels.
I have seen that, yes.
And that was a little tough because it's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they've stopped looking for work, right?
Sure.
So researchers had to dig a little deeper, and they're now telling us that male unemployment is at Depression era levels. That's truly tragic. So my book says, isn't it time to have some compassion on men? Isn't it time maybe to have some special programs geared toward men? In 1994, Congress passed the Equity, what was it called? The Equity Act, the Gender Equity Act, which poured billions of dollars into equity workshops and curricula to encourage girls. And in one sense, we should say, great, it's wonderful that girls are doing so well. We don't want to sound like we don't think it's good for girls to do well. But it's time to maybe pour some money and some effort into helping boys to succeed as well. I think it's about time as a society we address the problems that boys and men are facing.
Well, and it's true, and I think that's a great point. We can talk a little bit more about what you would encourage us as individuals to do as we get into that a little bit later. But I'm going to do this again. For those of you paying attention out there, okay, the toxic war on masculinity. That's what we're talking about. Professor Nancy Pearcey's latest book, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Again, I'll encourage you to get it. We were on a recent trip. We were talking off camera that my wife and I took to Toronto. We listened to the Audible version while she was highlighting some of the points that we're talking about today. You can do it either way. So Amazon.com, I'm sure, and probably a few other places. Well, thank you, Professor Pearcey. Fantastic conversation with her today. And I so appreciate her heart and what she's been called to do, to deep dive into and bring these culturally relevant topics to our awareness, as she did with this particular writing. And so we are going to break this down into two parts because we have so much more to talk about. And I want to invite you back again next time with Nancy Pearcey on the Embracing Brokenness podcast.
This was another episode of the Embracing Brokenness podcast. For more information on Embracing Brokenness Ministries, or to subscribe to our blog, podcast, YouTube channel, or engage with us on social media, please visit our website at embracingbrokenness.org. Thanks for joining us.